Welcome everyone. Just a couple minutes past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It's a real pleasure today to welcome Professor Jennifer Derr and Professor Shehab Ismail to join us for a conversation about Dr. Derr's book, The Lived Nile. So Dr. Derr is Associate Professor and Founding Director of the Center for Middle East and North African Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on colonial and post-colonial Middle Eastern history, environmental history, the history of science and medicine, and critical geography. She's received numerous honors, including the Science Foundation Career Award, and her second manuscript, The Liver in Egypt, Productions of an Organ Through 20th Century Public Health and Political Economy, traces the production of the liver as a site of knowledge, disease, and various forms of treatment in 20th century Egypt, as well as its significance to the history of biomedicine in the Global South and in the second half of the 20th century. She will be interlocuting with Dr. Shehab Ismail, who is joining us from London. He is a lecturer at Munich Center for Technology and Society of the Technical University of Munich. And his research combines perspectives from history of science, technology, medicine, urban history, and modern Middle Eastern history, as well as digital history. He's working on a book manuscript titled Waters of Cairo, the Engineers and the Technologies of Growth, which investigates the technology, political economy, and geography of water management in Cairo between 1865 and 1939, following the engineers who designed and managed the city's water supply and sewage systems while paying attention to the broader context of imperialism and capital investment. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Just to kind of give an overview of the format, we designed this as a conversation between the author and another scholar. Shehab will be posing the questions and Jennifer will respond. And then at the end, there'll be time for question and answer, which will be moderated by Shana Marshall, Associate Director of the Institute. Just before we get started, I want to thank Christian Clinton for taking care of all of the logistics of the event, and Elad Raymond for taking care of our publicity. So thanks so much for joining us. Shehab?
All right, so hello everyone. I want to thank the Institute for Middle East Studies for the invitation. Glad to be with all of you today and to be discussing Jennifer Derr's book, The Lived Nile. Jennifer and I have known each other for some years now, and it's so good to see the book in print. I have fond memories of the days we used to work together at the Egyptian National Archive. So before I pose my questions, let me say a few things quickly about the book. Egyptian irrigation has been the subject of numerous studies that tended to focus on the relevance of irrigation to the cultivation of cotton and the making of Egypt's monocrop colonial economy. Now, the Lived Nile does it differently. While recognizing the centrality of cotton to the story, the Lived Nile is more concerned with how the Aswan Dam reshaped the environment of the Nile Valley, as well as the very bodies of Egyptians. And I think at the heart of Derr's approach is this idea that the Nile is not a singular entity, but rather a realm of practices, temporalities, and a geography that structures human experience. And by foregrounding perennial irrigation as transformative of both the environment and the embodied experience, the book is equally attentive to expertise, mostly engineers and doctors, parasitic diseases, and the everyday life of the Egyptian peasantry. Now, having said that, I think I'm just going to jump into my first question. So my first question is really about the engineers, and particularly about how to approach the relationship between foreign and Egyptian engineers during the 4 decades of the British colonial period. And this is, and I'm asking this because throughout these 4 decades, Egyptian engineers were systematically excluded from top positions at the Public Works Ministry. So my question for Jen is, how did you approach this problem in your book? And more broadly, how can we strike a balance between our attempt to find the voice of Egyptian engineers on the one hand, while appropriately recognizing the power relations that excluded them from decision-making on the other?
Okay, I'm going to start my answer to that question with a thank you to the Institute of Middle East Studies and to Shana and Mona and Christian, and also especially to Shehab for agreeing to have this conversation with me. So I want to start this question about engineers with, well, I think there are multiple ways to answer the question. And so the first sort of overarching comment that I want to make is that at the center of my book lies a construction that I call the Perennial Nile River. So, as Shehab said, the premise of the book is an examination of the Nile, which doesn't assume that the river is an unchanging entity, across historical time and space, but rather thinks about the river as a realm of practice and a relational realm. And so, the book begins with a discussion of the ways in which the Nile had been engineered, especially under the Ottoman Egyptian state during the 19th century, and how that process of engineering shifted under the British. And I think, one observation that I would make is that there is an extensive historiography of that chronicles British approaches to engineering the Nile River. But that is a historiography that assumes a kind of absolute British authority and expertise when it comes to sort of approaching and constructing the river. So, for example, there's a kind of dominant idea that British engineers most of them were trained in India. They learned the art of irrigation in India because, there wasn't really extensive irrigation in Britain. And then they moved with their expertise from India to Egypt. And so kind of at the heart of the first chapter of my book, which is an exploration of engineering, is this narrative and the viability of this narrative. And I think that, when we think about the power relations among engineers and also the ways that Egyptian engineers would be systematically excluded from positions of authority at the ministry during the colonial period, I think the first question that raises is, what did it mean to be an engineer during the 19th century? That's a category that has particular valences in the 21st century and the second half of the 20th century. But in the 19th century, what it meant to be an engineer underwent a process of rapid transformation and change, and looked very different in different places. So, for example, when we think about how engineers were produced in 19th century Egypt, that is, the production of engineers is closely tied to the development of Mehmed Ali's state. So the founding of Dar Handasa in 1816, its kind of transformation into the Muhandisena in 1834, and then a kind of implementation of a formal process of education for Ottoman Egyptian state officials. That same institutional process and that same formal structure didn't exist in England during this same period. So English engineers were largely made through practices of apprenticeship. Many of them did not have formal education. And so when the British occupation of Egypt began, there's a real difference between who Ottoman Egyptian engineers are and who English engineers are. And so I think, during the 19th century, engineering is a kind of mad, crazy world in which you have some engineers, especially in France and Egypt, who are being trained by the state. And then you have other English engineers or European engineers who become appointees of the Ottoman Egyptian state, but don't necessarily have a kind of like rich background of technical training. And so, I think it really is a pretty diverse world, but it was not until the British occupation of Egypt that we see a kind of colonial power hierarchy develop. There certainly were Europeans who were directed to, or who were appointed to direct portions of Mehmed Ali's state, but there were not yet the same cultural power dynamics that we would see come to the fore during the British occupation. So it was during the British occupation that, British quote unquote engineers were appointed to direct various sections of the Egyptian Ministry of Public Works. And it's during this period that a narrative develops through which British engineers designed the perennial Nile River. And, one of the things that I wanted to push back against in the book is that, especially for the first 2 decades of the occupation, British engineers didn't have the knowledge or the expertise that they needed to actually administer irrigation on the Nile River. So, I chart this process through which, if one follows carefully the reports of the Ministry of Public Works, in the early years of the occupation, it's very, very rare for British engineers to use Arabic terms or to use local systems of either temporal measurement or physical measurement in the act of irrigation. And, one of the developments that can be seen through charting these reports is that increasingly, and especially by the early 1890s, British engineers are thinking through the categories that Egyptians had used to administer and manage the Nile River. And so, in thinking about authority, I think it's really important to realize that while British engineers were certainly appointed to kind of high positions of the state, there was no way that they could have accomplished the work that was the daily work of irrigation and Nile management without the active roles of Egyptian engineers and local officials who were working on the ground. And so, one of the questions that Shehab has asked me is, how do we think about this category of historical voice? And I think that, the straightforward way to do that is to look for voices in archival documents, which certainly we all do. But I also think it's really important, especially when we think about categories of technical expertise and environmental management, to think through processes of, what are the knowledge categories that we're working within? What kinds of work needed to be done within those knowledge categories? And how would that work have been done? So, the argument that I make in the book is that one can also look to find historical voice through action categories. And I think that especially when dealing with kind of colonial or neo-colonial knowledge systems, it's important to think through the active ways that colonial authorities attempted to claim and perform expertise, but that expertise would have been an impossible performance without the work of people who had local knowledge, who were working on the ground. And that group included engineers when we're thinking about Egypt in the late 19th century. I'm going to let you come back. That was a long answer.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for this answer. I'm going to follow with my second question, because I think it's related to what you said at the end about that argument that you make about expertise as a performance, which I found really intriguing, and to sort of think through with what this performance means and the kind of the material through which this performance unfolds, whether it is texts or engineering analytics or sort of categories of water management. So I think you make this argument for the first time in the book on page 11, where you say, the Lived Nile not only explores the what, who, and how of expertise, it argues that expertise is a performance, the fact of which is central to the process through which the possession of particular forms of knowledge is recognized and read as authoritative. And I found this really intriguing, and I also think that you actually followed through with this great insights, because you showed us how this performance happens through text, through the adoption of certain analytics, standards, and also the rejection of others. So I particularly enjoyed your analysis of how British engineers learned irrigation vernacular, how they spoke about the colors of the Nile water, so the green water versus the red water, and also the use, of course, of the Coptic calendar for understanding the cycle of the Nile. And my question for Jen is, how do you approach also the technical debates among engineers? And where does the technical fall in this idea of expertise as a performance? And I'm asking because at some places I felt that you were perhaps torn between wanting to say more about the technical disagreements and not wanting your book to delve too deeply into stories that may not be of direct relevance to your book. And I think a case in point is in chapter 2, page 62, where you discuss the debate between MacDonald and Wilcox. And I found myself just wanting to know more about, what was this problem about? So how did you sort of manage this?
Yeah, when I was writing the book, there's a period of time in which I was reading a lot about dams, but only masonry dams that were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So it was important that I knew how these dams were constructed. But I think you're right. I think I was torn about how much of that knowledge was kind of background knowledge that I needed to frame the narrative, and how much of those technical debates should feature in the text. And I want to be clear that I have no idea how a dam is built in the contemporary moment. I can only sort of build you a late 19th century dam. But I do, I think so on this question of, performativity and expertise, as academics, this is something near and dear to all of our hearts. It's something that we do every day through both text and speech. And so, one of the questions that I really wrestled with in the book is when looking at the kind of production of technical literature during the late 19th and early 20th century, and this is not new to the history of science or really the history of the state. Like, we know that there is a historical period in which states, begin to categorize and count and write and produce statistics. Like, this is well-worn theoretical ground. And I think that, a question that I asked myself quite extensively is, given that, especially in the first decades of the occupation, British engineers were placed in the position of being experts in a world in which they didn't have any real knowledge, right? So I think too much is made about the similarities among Northern India and Egypt, in the sense that I think those are similarities that are made through the construction of irrigation systems, which that largely happens in Northern India after the British occupation of Egypt begins. And so, I think I had to do a kind of historical reimagining of the positions that British engineers were in when they arrived in Egypt. And I just really don't see them as experts in any viable way. But they do write a lot, and they certainly write like experts. So when Shehab asked this question about technical literature, this is a great question. And it's a question I asked myself a lot when I was writing the book, because there are such volumes of statistics about the Nile, about the measurements of irrigation. The quantity of them is large. And a question I asked myself is, what use are these statistics doing? You know, like the way that they would be used in future management techniques is not always clear. And so I think that in thinking about the ways that text performs expertise, you know, one of the things that I notice about particular engineers is that there's a process by which they write more and more and more to demonstrate that the Nile is a thing that they understand and that they know how to master. And those texts, especially because they're composed in English and they travel quite widely throughout the world. So for example, the reports of the Egyptian Ministry of Public Works, they're available in libraries, you know, throughout the United States. They've been there for, you know, in many cases, more than a century. And so, you know, from the very beginning of the occupation, these reports are seen as international documents that will travel. And I think it really, the ways in which these documents travel and how British engineers write in these texts does a lot of work in sort of demonstrating the fact that the Nile is a British entity. And I think that we should approach that issue with a lot of skepticism. This question about technical debates, I did wrestle with it in the book. I mean, I think, you know, there's a point at which the construction of the first Aswan Dam, or Khazen Aswan, was complete. It started to fall apart nearly immediately, in the sense that, you know, these were periods in which dams were built. Sometimes they stood, other times they fell. And almost certainly there was a large amount of trial and error that went into the construction of dams. And so when the dam was built, it was found that, you know, some of the rocks that had been displaced to build the dam, the river was causing them to move in the water, and they were damaging the surface of the dam. And so what happens after the dam is built is there's a debate that unfolds almost immediately about raising the dam. And raising the dam also allows the British to repair the dam without only repairing the dam. So it provides a kind of cover for, you know, doing these repairs on the dam. And so, you know, part of that debate is this question about, can the dam be raised safely? And that question is linked to new mathematical analysis about, which is essentially material science, okay, about the strains and pressures that certain forms of materials can withstand, and whether the materials used to build the dam are appropriate for withstanding the strains and pressures that would come with raising the dam. And so, yeah, I mean, I did wrestle with whether more of that should have been included in the text. But I really felt like my job in this book, or my project in this book, was to think through the processes of construction and practice, rather than to sort of get lost in the technical details of an emerging field of civil engineering. And, you know, in part, I made that decision because I do think that in the case of other works, the decision to really delve into the specificities of those technical debates, you know, it does the work of, I think, reaffirming the expertise of colonial engineers. And that was not my project. My project was to think about context, to think about training, to think about institutions, and to think about knowledge forms. And so, yeah, but that was, I mean, it's interesting that you noticed that, because there was just a lot of material that didn't make it into the book, much of it about those kinds of technical debates.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, I bet because, I mean, as you know, I study sanitary engineers, and of course, technical disagreements are just ubiquitous among engineers. It's all over the place. And with this amount of literature written on the Nile and perennial irrigation, there has to be so many sort of technical choices and sort of technical controversies. And so thank you for kind of responding
I mean,
to this point.
I'm curious to see what you would say about your own work, but I would say yes and no. Like the quantity of the literature is tremendous, but it's also rather formulaic, you know? And I would say that, especially when it comes to perennial irrigation, it's, you know, there are technical debates, but those technical debates are limited. It's not a kind of overly technical set of decisions. I mean, I would say that the problems that flow from perennial irrigation create a much more complicated body of technical literature, whether that has to do with parasitic disease, whether that has to do with kind of, you know, soil salinity and, you know, the concentration of minerals in the soil, like those kinds of debates felt more technically rich to me than the types of literature that the ministry itself is producing. And I wonder, like, in the context of your own work, if you feel like colonial engineers, like what kind of work are those debates doing? I just asked you a question back. I know.
Yes.
I don't know if this is legal.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think in a way there is a way in which we can perhaps think about these technical disagreements as telling you something about just like a sort of an insight of how we can understand the life of this technology also. Because at the end of the day, you know, okay, they are the experts in the technology. They've constructed the technology. So perhaps there is a way in which we can look at these technical debates as indicative of perhaps like give us some kind of hypotheses of how to start investigating them. You know, it's not like that we're going to start assuming that the engineers know exactly what they're saying, or to sort of reassert their authorities, but to look at their disagreements as telling of something that is more fundamental about where the engineers are coming from. So perhaps their visions of engineering, right?
Yeah.
How do they think about the technical and the social? So there is a way in which I think these technical debates could be explored more. But again, you know, I really liked what you said now about how you decided that, okay, your project is really about the practice of the Nile, right? And the sort of the Nile as it's practiced and as it's lived, right? And this is really what gives your book this kind of this unity and sort of it makes it feel like as a sort of as this is a complete project. So yeah, it makes sense what you're saying.
But I think, I mean, sort of, you know, in response to what you said, I do think there is a real difference, you know, in especially the 1880s and the 1890s. I think there are real differences among British engineers who kind of cut their teeth in India and British engineers who are brought from London, right? So I think those are very, very different engineering cultures and approaches to the colonial built environment. But I also think, you know, a thing that I noticed, I think that coming from like in the anachronistic ways in which we can view technical expertise and engineering specifically, you know, I think I had to fight my own instinct because I wasn't finding evidence of this in the literature. In the period in which I work, I think there's a lot of building and then thinking through the building rather than the abstract conceptualization that results in the construction, right? And I think that, you know, I think that working from a later period, one assumes that things are imagined and anticipated as abstractions before they are built. And I think that happens less with the construction of Khazen S1. You know, like there certainly are technical models, but there is a lot of experimentation that happens through that actual construction process, because what it meant to build and engineer in the late 19th century, I think was just a fundamentally different process. You know, I also think the stakes of doing that in Egypt are different than the stakes of doing that in Europe. Like, I do think that the degree of risk that colonial projects assume is greater because it is viewed that, you know, in the event of their failure, somehow that's more permissible in the worlds of empire than it is in the metropole. And so I think that some of what I observed was specific to the worlds of empire.
All right, I'm gonna move on to the third question in the interest of time. So I'm going to actually fast forward a little bit and ask you about how did the contemporary discussions on the Nile shape the way you thought about your book, if at all? And I'm asking, of course, in light of the current politics of water in the Nile Valley, especially with the construction of the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which is definitely on the minds of Egyptians right now. So were you thinking about this as you wrote your book, or is this something that is now of interest to you?
My God, this is the biggest question. So the answer to that question is yes, broadly speaking. So, I think this book is not at all my dissertation, but some of the archival research in the book was done for my dissertation, and then some of it was done after I completed my dissertation. And so, the first observation that I would make is that when I first started my dissertation research, that was before really the controversy over the dam in Ethiopia had begun. And so, the first stages of research on the dam were done thinking about the high dam and the kind of contrast with the high dam, but not in a more contemporary frame. That all really shifted when construction on the dam in Ethiopia began, and all of the sudden, it became much more difficult in Darul to access anything having to do with irrigation in any period. So you and I know this well, right? And we know people who were dramatically impacted by it. But I think it was really interesting for me because it was through that process that I thought, oh, like this contemporary dam, like I should be thinking about the early 19th century as I think about the contemporary context. So in a sense, it was the state's own maneuvering vis-a-vis security clearance and archival access that made me sort of think about a much longer durée than I had been before. But I think a different question, and a question that certainly animates the book, is that, from a very early period, the Nile is so central to environmental components of Egyptian nationalism. So the kind of environmental imaginaries that inform Egyptian nationalism, the Nile is just really a central component of that. And that happens, in active form, even from the 1920s, right? So there is the kind of ill effects of perennial irrigation become evident very, very quickly. And yet there's never a real conversation about what it would mean to have a system of agriculture that's not perennially irrigated, right? Like, so that choice is just not a choice. And, even from the early 1920s, the interwar period Egyptian regime, in a certain sense, one of their first and most active realms of conflict with the British is over the Nile and over kind of laying claim to the systems of perennial irrigation that were in particular built during the occupation, and securing Egypt's share of the Nile waters, which is obviously a question and a concern that is contemporary. But I think I did spend a lot of time thinking about the environmental imaginaries of nationalism, where those come from, but also how they shift over time, right? So Tim Mitchell has made this point that, when one reads kind of popular development literature about Egypt, the kind of vision of Egypt as the Nile Valley, the dependence of Egypt on the Nile, it's overplayed, and it's always kind of crafted within this vision of scarcity. And that's both an accurate observation, but, Egypt's dependence on the Nile is also a real thing. And so I spent a lot of time just thinking about how how the significance of the Nile, and especially the dammed Nile, shifts over time, right? Like it is consistent, but it's not the same in the 1930s as it is in the 1960s, as it is in the early aughts, right? Like the stakes of those projects are very, very different. Nonetheless, the centrality of a dammed river remains. And something I think a lot about in the contemporary context is that one of the challenges of the completion of the dam in Ethiopia has been the possibility of water scarcity, although that's a large realm of debate, but also how Egypt has begun to step back particular water intensive practices of agriculture, like rice cultivation, that have long existed. And, Egypt, like many places with dammed rivers, not only dammed a river, but then continued to practice water intensive agriculture. And so I think, the contemporary debate is about Egypt's vulnerability in terms of its position on the Nile, but it's also about the forms of political economy and environmental management that grew up around that practice of the Nile.
Great. So I'm gonna move on to the fourth question. Okay, so the fourth question is really based on a statement that you make on page 46, and it's obviously a statement that structures the book in a way, but I kind of wanted to sort of push you a little bit on this.
Yeah.
So on page 46, you say, once constructed, the dam and the practices of the Nile that it helped produce would not be undone. So I thought about this idea because I think it's kind of evocative of thinking about technology and sort of the irreversibility of large-scale technology. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you about this, like how do you conceptualize this irreversibility if you think about it this way? And if I want to ask it in another way, are the flows of water, capital, and expertise that is enabled by the dam indicative of, let's say, what STS scholars call technological momentum? Is this an argument about the agency of technology, or about the fixity of the sort of the new social order that technology helped create?
So I think it's an argument. Well, I think it's an argument about political economy. And I also think it's an argument about the significance of the material world in our imaginations of political economy in the future, right? And so, like you, I am steeped in the traditions of STS, but I think that one of the things that STS doesn't do particularly well is political economy. And I think that in thinking, I would say that when I was writing the book, I thought about the phrasing of that particular sentence very carefully. And I think, there are certain examples in the US in which dams have been taken down in, more recent years. Nonetheless, I think that for a whole host of reasons, that has never been a possibility in Egypt, right? That has never been a conversation, despite the considerable public health costs and environmental effects, especially of the high dam, which were not secrets when the high dam was constructed. And so there is a kind of, it's a good question that, how do you think about, I don't think it's about technological agency. So I think that's too simple of an answer, right? I think it's about the ways in, when we're dealing with a space, especially a space of agriculture, and then in the later period, a space of agriculture, electricity, and industry, I think that, whole environmental systems and ways of life were built up around the particular practices of damming the Nile River. And so I think that to me is about the materialities of political economy. And, obviously that's also associated with particular social orders, right? associated with one social order during the interwar period, another social order during the Nosthorst period. But I think that to say that it's a social order, I think in a certain way undermines the significance of thinking about political economy as a material world, right? So when I was writing this book, as you noted, and as I thought about all the time, in a certain sense, one of the challenges of writing this book is that I was writing in a period of Egyptian history that is the most narrated period of Egyptian history, right? There's so much literature on cotton and land tenure and the social relations of the countryside. And I didn't see myself as writing in a way, that's literature that was all really important to me. But I think that one of the things that I saw that was missing is the ways in which imaginations of political economy are always about the material world, but there's no consideration of the materialities of the material world when we think about political economy, right? Political economy remains a kind of very, very human formation. And so especially because I was writing within worlds of agriculture, it was really important to me to write a story about political economy that was material and environmental, but also political economic. Is that a word? I'm going to say it is right now. And so I think that, I'm thinking about the fact that this would not be undone. It's not that it could not be undone. It just, within the realm of historical possibility, it wasn't. And, I think it will not be. And so it's those ways of how do you imagine historical possibility and explain the contingencies of historical possibility specifically. I'm thinking with you. And so I'm thinking out loud. But so I think that, oftentimes the debate about dams, especially in a contemporary context, is to dam or not to dam. It's a kind of cost benefit analysis of dams. And I just think that, for someone working on Egypt, it becomes very, very clear that the cost benefit analysis is not an adequate method of historical analysis. There's just so much about the history of Egypt and the Nile that a kind of simple cost benefit analysis doesn't explain.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this response. So I have one final question, and I see that we hit the 45-minute mark, but I'm just going to ask it anyway.
It's because I'm wordy.
Or because these are significant problems that need a lot of time to actually reflect on. So I really appreciated how your book connected large-scale hydraulic technology to regimes of labor, to the bodies of Egyptians, and particularly to how the bodies of Egyptians became the object of, as you say, it racialized medical categories. Yeah. So my question is, to what degree do you think, let's say, colonial science or colonial medicine is a useful category for you? And I'm asking because I think that you sort of deploy the concept maybe on the one hand, but on the other hand, some of your stories, like this fascinating story of this Egyptian doctor Khalil and Barlow, and the kind of the back and forth between them, it suggests that this question is a question for the medical practitioners themselves, that they themselves are kind of occupied with, how colonial is science or how colonial is medicine, that they themselves are actively thinking about these parameters. And I'm wondering whether you also think the same, or do you think that, just generally, do you think that colonial medicine is a useful category, or do you think that your analysis actually makes it more complex than that?
I think that's a great question. So before I answer the question, for people who haven't read the book, I'll just say that there's a portion of the book which looks at the centrality of agricultural labor in building the perennial Nile and the environments of the perennial Nile. And one of the effects of that agricultural labor and the shift to perennial irrigation was to dramatically increase the prevalence of a set of diseases. And those diseases included Schistosomiasis or bilharzia, hookworm, and also pellagra. And I can talk about those things in more depth. But so hookworm and bilharzia, the prevalence of those diseases was directly linked to the process of agricultural labor, and especially bilharzia. Pellagra, like in many places of the world, results from a kind of shift to increased consumption of corn. Corn is grown on a similar growing schedule as cotton. It's commonly a food of the poor. That is another kind of story. And so, and just to give you a sense of the scale, we have kind of surveys of disease from the 1930s that are pretty reliable, and I can talk about why and how. But in areas of Egypt that had access to perennial irrigation, the average prevalence of bilharzia infection was averaged about 60%, but could be as high as 90%. And in areas of the country that still practice basin irrigation, that prevalence was about 5%, right? So it's just this transformation from a world in which a parasitic disease is present to a world in which it's normative, right? So it becomes a normative habitation of the body. And so, it's interesting because I think, so Shehab, I think your question, at the center of your question is this question of when we think about medical systems, how we think about the relationships and power dynamics that define those medical systems, right? And during the colonial period, and this is also the case for the story of engineering that we just discussed, those power relations include relationships among experts, right? So European experts and Egyptian experts. And then they also include relationships among experts and their patients. And it's really, really difficult to think about the question of how patients perceived a kind of changing medical infrastructure. Like, we do know some things about that, right? So we have information that, in the first half of the 19th century, that is a kind of mixed story in which patients sometimes actively rebelled against the state's medical interventions and avoided its hospitals. But at the same time, and we know this from the work of Khaled Fahmy and Liat Kozma, they also used new methods of medical examination to their favor, especially in legal cases. So it's a complicated story. One of the things that we see happen during the colonial period is that there are more patients attending hospitals, and those include both state hospitals, but also private hospitals that are established in major cities. So Shana Minkin's book talks about the kind of role of private hospitals. And so there's some reason to believe that more patients are voluntarily coming to hospitals. I suspect that is because more patients are sicker with the set of diseases that are associated with perennial irrigation, and that oftentimes have much more extreme symptoms. But this category of colonial medicine, I think that's a great question. Like, for an Egyptian patient who is, perhaps suspicious of the institution writ large, right, and is traveling to these institutions from a place in the countryside, like, is there a fundamental difference in perception between a state institution in the late 19th century and a state institution, 7 years later under British occupation? I can't answer that question. I have some, my suspicion is that those would have been alienating institutions writ large. However, among experts, there is certainly a colonial medical dynamic, right? So both in the fields of engineering and in the fields of medicine, the British take active steps to degrade the educational systems that train professionals and make those individuals less professional. It becomes nearly impossible for Egyptians to assume positions of authority within ministries, right? And so they're kind of kept out of those positions. And people with means tend to travel to Europe during this period, somewhat ironically, so that they have different kinds of postings in the world of science. But I do think, one of the dynamics, something that I was thinking about when you asked this question about the Nile is the question of high modernism. So, when thinking about damming the Nile River and building these large pieces of infrastructure, in the 50s and the 60s, we use the imaginaries and the categories of high modernism to think through what that means. I think that some of that starts in the 30s and the 40s as well, especially in places like Egypt. And, I think that this debate about, how British is the interwar state, I think that at least in the Department of Public Health and then the Ministry of Public Health, there are active steps that Egyptian technocrats take to push the British, to sideline the British within those ministries and to take much more active leading roles. And so, at the same time, I think that, I talk about this physician, Muhammad Khalil, a lot in the work. And I think that for Khalil, who had spent time elsewhere in the worlds of empire and in the worlds of science, on the one hand, he is operating within Egypt as a world, but on the other hand, he's really fighting to be recognized as a kind of international scientific authority or medical authority in worlds of medicine that are still dominated by these colonial hierarchies. So I think that when we talk about expertise, the category of colonial medicine makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about the relations among experts. When we're thinking about the relations among patients and experts, I think that's a much more difficult question to answer.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Shehab.
Okay, I guess it's time for audience questions. I don't actually see any audience questions in the chat box yet, but sometimes it takes people a few minutes to get up the nerve to ask a question. Okay, so we have one from Mona. She says, I really appreciate how your book centers the body of the agricultural laborer and couldn't help but notice that your next book is about liver disease. Could you talk a bit about how the insights about schistosomiasis impact on these laborers may have inspired your next project?
Sure. Mona, you also just pointed out like my major struggle with my second project, which is to make sure that it's not like the Lived Nile Part 2, because there are connections, but I'm also focused on a kind of different set of questions. So yeah, there are sort of deep and broad historical connections. So just as a basic framework, there are two species of Schistosoma parasites that cause schistosomiasis in Egypt. One of the developments of the kind of middle 20th century is a flip-flop in which form of those parasites is more prevalent. And the form of the parasite that becomes more prevalent in the second half of the century is Schistosoma mansoni, which one symptom of Schistosoma mansoni can be like severe liver damage. So that's one piece of the story. Another piece of the story, and I talk about this in the 5th chapter of my book, is that beginning in the 1920s, the interwar period Egyptian regime begins a large-scale treatment campaign for schistosomiasis. And that treatment campaign is really very, very extensive. So by the middle of the 1940s, almost 500,000 Egyptian patients are moving through these treatment centers and being treated for schistosomiasis each year. And one of the effects of this treatment program, because this was a treatment program that used glass syringes, which were boiled between patients, which was common practice during this period. But one of the effects of this treatment program was that large numbers of Egyptians became infected with the hepatitis C virus. And it seems that based on the kind of scientific literature, that's a process that begins kind of in earnest in the middle of the 1930s, when these treatment programs really expand quite tremendously. And that also, that so many people are infected with hepatitis C is shrouded for many decades because schistosomiasis continues to be such a large problem. Much of the liver damage that's associated with Schistosoma mansoni was in fact caused by hepatitis C, but that's not known yet. And because hepatitis C, because of like a shift in visualization technologies, the hepatitis C virus wasn't visualized or seen for the first time until 1989, right? And so this is a kind of, that Egypt has such a huge prevalence of hep C and also hep B, although that's less focused on. That's a kind of discovery of the early 1990s. And so there is a kind of common thread linking the story that I'm telling in the second book to the story of the Lived Nile. What I'm much more concerned about in the second book, well, I'm concerned with a few different things. So on the one hand, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the development of biomedicine in Egypt and in the global South more broadly. So in the history of medicine, this formation of biomedicine, which is basically Western medicine or allopathic medicine, is a formation that people talk about as emerging after the Second World War and happening in Europe and the United States. But many of the traits associated with that development are not unique to Europe and the US, and especially in a place like Egypt that has a deep history of medical institutionalization. You know, the traits that mark biomedicine in other places, like the development of a pharmaceutical industry, like the authority of clinicians, these are not unique to Europe and the States. They also exist in Egypt in different forms, but nonetheless. And so, you know, part of the project of the second book is to think about the history of biomedicine from one particular site in the global South, and how that develops in distinct ways, but also common ways. You know, Shehab's question about colonial medicine also, you know, colonial medicine doesn't end with the colonial period, right? And the institutions and practices of global public health continued and continue to be quite colonial in their practice and conceptualization. And so, you know, thinking about national histories of biomedicine, especially when it comes to questions of, you know, quote unquote tropical diseases, also demands that one engages with broader formations of global public health. So that's also part of the second project. But I think, you know, one of the things I would say, and I don't think, there's a part of my second book which I don't think is particularly radical, but I think is really important. And that is that within the histories of science and the histories of medicine, too often histories of quote unquote discovery are associated with, you know, a kind of implicit notion of progress and technology. And we can see this in the whole discourse around COVID and, you know, what is going to save us from COVID. And so part of the project of the second book is to look at a field of medicine in which Egyptian experts, physicians, and scientists really played leading roles in the development of knowledge and practice, and to write those developments back into a broader history of medicine. And so, you know, I don't think that's a radical project, but I think it's an important project because while there have been many changes in how people think about the history of biomedicine, it's still largely associated with Europe and the United States. And there are ways in which we still don't think about that as a global history. And that excludes many, many experts from the global South who played leading roles in, you know, the development and kind of, you know, I'm going to use this word progress, even though I feel really complicated about that, of treatment therapies, of, you know, especially with tropical medicine, observations about the worlds in which it was situated. And so those are the connections of the first book and the second book, and also the ways in which I see the second book is pretty different.
Wonderful, thanks so much. I don't see another question from the audience, but I have a question. Were there any, and if so, could you tell us a little bit about them, any internal critiques that were coming from sort of the Egyptian engineering class or from within ministries about a critique of development and the loss of life that led to the construction of large infrastructure projects, right? So was anyone, I'm sure they were, I don't know if it's available in archives or not, but what were they saying about that that trade-off that they were experiencing in order to build this large infrastructure?
I mean, yes and no. So certainly by the 1930s, there are, I'm going to call them socially concerned elites in Egypt. Like, the illness of the Egyptian peasantry and the kind of state of being in rural Egypt, that is a subject of active conversation in the interwar period among Egyptian elites, right? So that is certainly something that is frequently commented on. And there are people who imagine themselves as kind of rural social reformers. I think that Ahmed Shouq and Omnia El-Shakri, like their work, I think really highlights some of the roles, some of what happens in the interwar period, especially around ideas of kind of imagined social reform. And landowners certainly are concerned with questions of disease because it makes their laboring force less productive. So, the Rockefeller Foundation runs a long project in Egypt that begins in the late 1920s and stretches through the 1930s. And it's a kind of hygiene project. It's a hygiene project that's designed to reduce the prevalence of parasitic disease. They do this at other sites as well, including the American South. And large landowners are really interested in this project. Like they're really interested in Rockefeller Foundation interventions on their estates. And so, yes, there is critique. And, as we see from like other work in the interwar period, I'm thinking about Amy Jo Johnson's book, and the Ministry of Social Affairs, like there is critique and there is action in terms of, improving the conditions of livelihood in the countryside. And I think, by the time we start to think about the shape that program assumes in the Nasserist period, as others have argued, that really takes root in the interwar period, like that kind of project of social reform. At the same time, there's not a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of, there is some critique of perennial irrigation, but it's not a kind of normative vein of critique. And in terms of kind of questions of controversy, there's much more controversy around, the flooding of the Philae Temple, which happened after the construction of Khazan Aswan, than there is around like the increased prevalence of bilharzia. Because bilharzia from the very beginning, there's a kind of once, as was often the case in the colonial period, in and around 1910, the parasites that caused bilharzia were found in the organs of ancient Egyptian mummies. And so emerges a kind of discourse about the endemicity of bilharzia, right? And so bilharzia is forever taught, and this is true to the current day. Like almost every scientific article about bilharzia, whether it's being written abroad or in Egypt, begins with a discussion of the ancientness of bilharzia. Okay, and I would argue that this is, it's a disease of colonial economy that then becomes a disease of political economy more broadly. But I think that's really important because there's a kind of shift. This idea of bilharzia as endemic allows it to be framed as a problem of development and a problem of technology rather than a problem of political economy. Right. And that persists, right? So there's a lot of critique and conversation about disease in the countryside, but that is a thing to be overcome through development rather than, a thing to be analyzed and associated with particular environmental strategies of political economy.
Right. Yeah, that sounds perfectly like exactly what's going on all the time through history and continues to go on today. Okay. Yeah.
No, I
Sorry.
wanted to say a quick thing. Sorry, Shehab asked me these really provocative questions, and they continue to percolate in my mind as I continue to talk. But one of the questions I was thinking about, and I would love to talk about this more, especially with Shehab, is, I am thinking back to this question about engineering education during the 19th century. And so, I have certain pieces of information about the, what it meant to train as an engineer in Egypt, and especially surrounding the establishment of the Mohandes Khana, right? But I think the thing that I ask myself a lot is, and I am not certain that this doesn't exist in Darul Usaid, because as you and I both have talked about a little bit, some of my research was determined by access, which shifted pretty dramatically in the period in which I was working on the book. But by the time I was interested in the Mohandes Khana, one of the things that I couldn't go back and look for because of access issues were the records of those institutions, right? And the kinds of education, I have course listings and things like that, but I'm really interested in this connection between abstraction and education, and how people were using an education in mathematics to produce practices of engineering. And I suspect that one could answer that based on Khalid's work. I suspect that one could answer that question through the archives in Darul Usaid. But I've this linkage, and this comes up in medicine too, this linkage between how people are being educated and what forms of thinking that leads to in the field. That is a thing that I still continue to think about. Like, that is, I think, a missing piece in the work.
Shehab, did you want to respond to that at all? I do have another question from the audience now.
I think we should take the audience's question, and then maybe I'll come back at the end if there's more time.
Okay, wonderful. This is from Mateen Biglari. He says, I also really loved your emphasis on embodied subjectivity in the book. To what extent can this be applied to the engineers that you look at? What was the place of embodied knowledge in the performance of expertise? I'm thinking of this because of the ambiguities in engineering over the validity of different types of knowledge, at least in the British tradition.
Yeah, so I think I talk about this in small part in the book, but there certainly is an embodied performance of expertise, especially, so William Wilcox is impossible to avoid. He writes prolifically and colorfully. He is in Egypt for, he arrives in Egypt in the early 1880s. He's there until the time of his death. And so it's impossible to avoid his footprint. He also was the child of a military engineer and grew up in India and does a lot of performance that these other British engineers don't know anything about empire, and that he's a child of empire and has more expertise. So I bring this all up because in Wilcox's writing, especially in his memoirs, like, he writes a lot about these kind of embodied encounters with the Egyptian countryside, right? So he always is talking about how he's crossing irrigation canals, and he lives on a diet of whiskey and dried apricots. And, he's always there's a lot of kind of Wilcox getting dirty and showing that he knows the countryside. And so I do think there are these, I do think embodiment is really important. I also think that I've talked about this with people a lot, and it's something I'm still definitely thinking through. But I think with physicians, physicians do less of that narrating of embodiment, although when you interview physicians, they narrate embodiment in other ways. And so that's not an absent process, but there's a kind of transformation in medical writing that starts really in the kind of 30s and the 40s, in which medical writing becomes much more passive and much more abstract, and much less about experience. And this, I think, just has to do with publication standards in medical publications. But so in certain ways, when you're looking
back to the deep past, it becomes more difficult to get at questions of embodiment. But I also think that, how do I say this? I think that especially with physicians, by the 1930s, the physicians that I think with are really eager to be considered physicians as other physicians. So they do a lot less narrating of their Egyptianness and a lot more narrating of a kind of like cold, hard vision of expertise. And so that's more tricky, but, also with embodiment, in the diseases of perennial irrigation were not always determined by class, but were usually determined by class, right? And so, it is certainly true that people who were not of the kind of working poor in the countryside became infected with bilharzia, because if you lived somewhere in the countryside, it's really common for kids to like swim in irrigation canals in the summer, just normal things in life. But it was not an urban disease for the most part. And so I think that those questions of embodiment are also really class specific.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks everyone. I think Mona's going to go ahead and wrap it up and introduce our next lecture. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Shehab. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. It was great.
Yes, thanks so much for this great conversation. It was really wonderful to hear you two exchange ideas and have a conversation about your work, Jennifer. Please do join us for the next event in the IMIS lecture series, which is Lori Allen in conversation with Ari Dubnoff about her new book, A History of False Hope, Investigative Commissions in Palestine. And that will be on May 6th at the same time. So thanks so much, everyone. And we did put a link to the book in the chat if you're interested in getting a copy of the Lived Nile. Right, take care. Thank you.